What is up, duelists, and welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh discussion video. I was working on a little bit of a scripted video on what good Yu-Gi-Oh is to me, and while I was doing that, I kind of realized there's a lot of different topics in there that some of them I would rather split up into its own video. So today we are talking about negates in Yu-Gi-Oh. Of course, a very present mechanic in a lot of different forms. And if you look past, the generic Omni negate that we're also going to cover, there's a lot to it, I think, and they are a very fundamental part to the game, but they do need to be balanced properly, which is something we're going to talk about today. And this is meant to be a little bit of a conversation starter of sorts, something that I want to get your guys' opinion on, and I want to get people talking about this aspect of the game. So I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. If you do, make sure to leave a like on the video and most importantly, subscribe. We are getting super close to 100K. Once again, I really appreciate you all for the support and for getting me all the way up here, but just a couple more. So if you're not subscribed yet, then feel free to do so. But yeah, hope you enjoyed today's discussion and make sure to let me know your opinion in the comments. Now, the thing I want to get out of the way first, before we even start talking about different forms of negations and which ones are healthy and which ones might not be, I want to get one thing straight, which is that I think, and let me know if you agree or not, but as with everything in Yu-Gi-Oh, if there's an abundance of negates, if someone reaches critical mass with negates, it can make for pretty uninteresting gameplay, right? Maybe if someone ends on an interactive board that has one way to negate a card, then that's fine. But if someone ends on something like Mitsurugi Yami endboard and Master Duel these days. This is just the thumbnail I found when I was looking for a picture of a Mitsurugi Yami endboard, but this is a realistic endboard for Mitsuyami and Master Duel right now, where they end on not just the Mitsurugi trap, which maybe you could consider healthy if it was in pure Mitsurugi, but also Baron the Fleur, also Herald of the Arclight, and then all the Yami and Mitsurugi interruptions on top of that. So essentially you're able to negate 3 out of your opponent's 6 cards if they didn't hand trap you at all. And then they're playing with 3 cards against all the rest that you still have. So I feel like we should or could all agree on the fact that this type of stuff is not healthy and also not fun. And similar things with cards like Herald of Ultimateless, right? When Drytron was doing all of this, right? And so this is the type of thing that people criticize when they say like, oh, people just make 7 negate boards in Yu-Gi-Oh or whatever. Of course, people exaggerate, but sometimes stuff like this happens. And I feel like it is not very healthy. And I think negates do play a role in this situation. One thing that I want to be clear about though is that this is not only the case with negation, this is the case with pretty much any form of like interaction. If you just have too much of it, it might become unhealthy, right? This is not exclusive to negates, but of course, if you look at this specific end board, it does play a pretty big role that you can negate the best 3 cards in your opponent's hand because you choose which ones you negate, right? And another thing that I want to get out there, and I guess I have to also say this before I criticize the Odeon deck, right? Because the Odeon deck technically is not really like a modern combo deck. Whenever I make these discussions on game design and game balance, right? Only because I criticize one thing does not mean that another thing is okay. For example, if I criticize the Odeon deck for just basically being a deck full of negates for every single card the opponent plays, that does not mean I think that combo slop is okay, all right? But the Odeon deck at the moment is one of my least favorite decks to play against in Master Duel, and I play against it pretty regularly. It is decently popular because quite frankly, literally every single card in that deck is there to stop your opponent from playing the game, right? Like it's the Odeon cards put up 1 to 2 negations, maybe 3 if you can get to 2 copies of Swamp Deity, Anti-Verdict of Anubis. If you draw the Primite Engine, that's an extra negate via Drill Beam, and then every single hand trap in the deck negates as well, right? They play Ash, Dominus Purge, Dominus Impulse, Veiler, Imperm, you name it. Literally every time I play against that deck, they try to negate every single card that I play, and I do find that to be a pretty unhealthy game pattern in general. So the first thing I want to get out of the way when we talk about negates is that if they happen too often, if there is too many in a certain deck, in a certain place, it is uninteresting gameplay, right? This goes for trap cards in the Odeon deck. This goes for Omni negates on generic extra deck monsters in the Mitsurugi Yami deck in this example. It goes for cards that are accessible from the main deck, like Herald of Ultimateless, which just repeatedly negates a card on one monster, right? But it also goes for decks that play 20 plus hand traps and try to negate every single thing that the opponent is trying to do, right? That is one of my least favorite things in modern Yu-Gi-Oh is when this kind of gameplay happens where the main form of interaction with the opponent is a negate. So Basically, my baseline on negates is that they can exist, but I would really like if they weren't, if there wasn't that many of them, right? Like if a deck ends on one, then I'm much more okay with it than if the entire goal of the deck is to negate everything that your opponent does, right? One quick thing for all the TCG duelists from Europe and mainly Germany, there is a regional happening at the Gamescom LAN event in Cologne on March 22nd, which is a Sunday. If you want to take part in this regional, which I also might take part in, I'm not sure yet because that's the same weekend as the Master Duel Duelist Cup coming up, but I might be there because I might need the Worlds points for the TCG Worlds race. I'm not sure yet, but there's a chance you might meet me there. Anyways, all the info to this regional is in the description down below. It is organized by a friend of mine, so I'd appreciate if you checked it out, and if you have time, if you stopped by. Without further ado, let's get back into the video. So that's the baseline, right? But let's now let's distinguish between different types of negations because they are not all the same, right? We've got cards that can negate everything, right? We've got Baron the Fleur, which is probably the most popular poster child of this category, even though it's now banned in the TCG, but Master Duel still has it. This card is obviously super, super powerful because it just negates anything that your opponent is trying to do. It doesn't matter if it's in hand, in grave, on field, activation of a card, activation of an effect, does not matter. Baron can negate it. The only small form of a drawback on this card is that it is once while it's face up on the field, so it's not a once per turn. It doesn't refresh basically at the end of the turn, but still an incredibly powerful sort of effect. In this case, personally, where I stand on Omni Negates is that I feel like they are quite frankly just too powerful, and also they feel like the least interactive way of approaching the game, right? Because technically a negate is interaction with your opponent. You know, your opponent does something, you negate it, technically you've interacted, but Omni Negates just don't feel like their interaction, right? It just feels like when your opponent does something and you just straight up negate it, and there's no way to dodge it for the opponent, which is something we're going to get to with like other cards that target and then negate the card that they target or something like that, right? This just feels like it doesn't really have counterplay. This is just something that like either you have a way to force the Baron out before your important card, or your important card gets negated. There's not really much to do, right? Then we have cards that are more limited in what they can negate, which is, for example, Appaloosa Bow of the Goddess, only able to negate monster cards. And believe it or not, Appaloosa is banned for good reason, but also is, in my opinion, when you just look at the negation, a less powerful card than Baron the Fleur. What Appaloosa has over Baron the Fleur is that it can go in basically every deck because it's a link monster instead of a synchro. You know, a synchro, even though still relatively easy to access, is slightly harder to make than a link monster. And so every single deck that creates a bunch of monsters can just spit out an Appaloosa to negate multiple monster effects, right? But on paper, a monster negation that doesn't work on spell or traps make this card more vulnerable than Baron the Fleur. You know, like during Appaloosa formats, people were trying different ways to play the game, going second stuff like Talons take the Appaloosa and then use it against the opponent, Change of Heart, Snatch Steal, what you name it. There were certain ways to maneuver around an Appaloosa Bow of the Goddess. The thing that made this card toxic were both its accessibility, because it was a link monster, and also the fact that it was multiple negates on one card, which is a whole nother dimension of powerful, right? We've talked about Herald of Ultimateness a moment ago, but like essentially, if Appaloosa was just one monster negate on a Link 4, it would have already been a pretty powerful card, but the fact that it was multiple was what ultimately ended up making it way too powerful. Another aspect when we talk about balancing of Omni Negates is that sometimes they can be on relatively small monsters, like Herald of the Arclight over here, which was a card that, because of its low level, was actually sometimes harder, sometimes easier to make, but also had some outplay potential because you could sometimes normal summon an attack over Herald of the Arclight, and that made it slightly better to deal with. You know, this is something that, try normal summoning something that beats over Baron the Fleur, right? But the problem with this card, once again, is that this had bonus effects, right? Like, this is obviously, at the moment, I think this card is not banned because of its Omni Negate. This card is banned because it searches Habakiri, and it's also banned because they also put a Floodgate effect on it, right? Which, in my opinion, is completely insane card design-wise. I guess they printed it a long time ago when it was really hard to make level 4 synchros and when decks weren't as combo heavy yet. So I guess it was okay. Like, this card came out when, like, 2014. Yeah, like, this card came out in a different time, but has aged very poorly. But what this teaches us, in my opinion, once you start adding bonus effects to cards that have Omni Negates, I think that's definitely the wrong direction, right? I think Stuff like Appaloosa, Baron, and Herald, that teaches us that these cards need downsides. They don't need upsides, right? They cannot have upsides. If they have upsides, they will be abused at some point. There's no way around that. So yeah, and then of course, one thing that all of these had in common right now is that they are extra deck monsters, which means that they are accessible every single time, which is an interesting topic in and of itself, because I don't think accessibility and consistency is necessarily a problem. I think things that are like, consistency is a good thing, right? Because no one wants to lose because they just couldn't play the game. So like having consistent access to cards that are fair and balanced is good, but of course it becomes much more of a problem when you have consistent access to cards that are not fair and balanced, right? Which was the case with all of these cards, which is why luckily all of these are banned in the TCG right now, and unfortunately 2 out of those 3 are still legal in Master Duel, so that's not the greatest, but it is what it is. Zaylin the Shackled Dragon is an interesting card, and honestly, probably my favorite example of a negation that comes from the extra deck right now. And the reason for this is that the way this card works actually means it comes with actual outplay potential. And this is going to be very clear once I'm done with discussing all of these cards in today's video, what I mean by this, but when someone summons Zaylin the Shackled Dragon, there is actually room for the opponent to maneuver around this card. Even though this card in theory can negate any card in the game, it only negates it if you're able to create a chain around it, basically. So if Zaylin wants to negate a card that's activated as Chainlink 1, there has to be a Chainlink 2. And then Zaylin has to be Chainlink 3 in order to negate either Chainlink 1 or Chainlink 2. If Zaylin is Chainlink 4, it can only negate Chainlink 2 or 3. So the way this card works is if your opponent activates Raigeki, you have to chain something else to it before you can negate it with Zaylin. And if you chain something else to that, if your opponent then chains to your Chainlink 2, Zaylin is going to be Chainlink 4 and cannot negate Raigeki on Chainlink 1 anymore because it's too far down the chain, essentially, right? Because Zaylin can only negate the card it responds to or the card that that card responds to. It's a little bit more complex of a card, but that's also the reason why I like it and why I think it is a fairer way to make a negation. Of course, sometimes you're not going to have a way to quote-unquote chain block the Zaylin, and then it's just going to negate your Raigeki in this example, but not all the time, right? There is potential to maneuver around it, and I think this is a very important factor to make negates feel more interactive, right? At least there's a loophole that your opponent can play into if they're trying to outmaneuver the Zaylin, if they're trying to make their really important card resolve. There is ways for you to do that, right? Most importantly, there is ways that are not negating your negate, right? Because of course, yes, you can droplet a Baron or you can imperm a Baron or whatever, right? But like I think it's pretty clear why I think having to draw a negate for the negate to not negate your important play is not the most interactive play pattern, right? But yes, so I do think there is a world where like negation from the extra deck can happen, but it does need to be carefully balanced, at least the way that I feel like. Because, or I guess it begs the question, what would happen if we had no negates at all, right? Like what if we just reached a point where negation just wasn't printed on extra deck monsters anymore, and like we just leave cards like Appaloosa, Baron, Herald of the Arclight, we just leave them banned, and we just try to find other interactions, right? Because there's so many other things that decks can end on. You know, you have all kinds of removal, you can create card advantage and follow up, you can have cards that are maybe hard to out or hard to deal with. Nothing forces them to make negates for every deck, right? It's not something that needs to happen. I guess we're at a point where having one, let's say one negate on your end board available could be considered necessary for certain formats, because otherwise there are a lot of blowouts these days. You know, if no deck was using any sort of negate anymore, then people would just go crazy with cards like Lightning Storm, Harpy's Feather Duster, Evenly Matched, you name it, which are all cards, of course, that were created because people were ending on more powerful end boards, and so they created these cards to combat more powerful end boards. So now if we get rid of all forms of negation, they would technically also have to get rid of all of these in order to create a more balanced environment, right? But this is a very difficult topic, the whole like scaling down the power level of Yu-Gi-Oh, because you would basically have to power down both sides equally, right? You'd have to like tone down the negates, but then you also have to tone down the crazy board breakers. Otherwise, they always crack every board. which is interesting, but at the same time, I think is not super realistic. So I do think there is a place for certain negations to happen. You're gonna laugh because it's Josh loving Draco Tail again, but I do think Draco Tail Flame is a good example of this. It does have a lot of things going for it. It does protect an otherwise pretty fair deck from blowout cards like Duster and Lightning Storm. Doesn't protect from evenly. Has counterplay because you can dodge it with everything that removes the spell from the field because it targets the spell in order to negate it. It does have the draw in it, which is a bonus on the one hand, but also makes it vulnerable to Ash and Bell. So I feel like this is something that I don't know. I vibe with the design on this. I do think it is the least interesting card in Draco Tail, to be fair, because I do like Draco Tail as the like interactive deck that it is. And I think this card, if your opponent doesn't have an out to it, of course, it's just like, oh, you activate a powerful spell, I negate it, which is, in my opinion, the least interesting interaction that Draco Tail has. I think all the other things feel more dynamic in the deck. I think it does have a merit. If it's in a deck where it's the only form of negation most of the time, I think it's okay, at least. Nothing too crazy, right? Which I guess brings me to the next topic, or the next kind of negation, which is just searchable negation in these decks. Because this is something that a lot of these decks have nowadays, is they just have like this one trap card that they can search. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm always disappointed when the searchable trap card for an archetype is just negate, like Mitsurugi Great Purification here. But once again, I think it depends so much on context, right? Like I think this card in pure Mitsurugi is fine, right? It's just if it's added to the mix in other boards that are not meant to be backed up by multiple negations, like when a Yami Mitsu deck all of a sudden, even if it's not Master Duel Mitsuyami, even if you look at when Mitsuyami was powerful in the TCG, like the fact that it just had this trap card plus Herald of the Arclight next to a Yami board, next to a Mitsu board, it was just too much. It was too much. Like maybe Dark Ruler could have been an answer to that deck. Like it was a legit solution if they didn't have the trap card, but they had the trap card. So I think it's frustrating when that happens. And I think that is the danger when you make searchable traps that are just negates, right? Because what's the alternative is like you can just make a solid back row card for these decks that is not a negation, which would mean that the board is still better into Dark Ruler, like because you have layers to it. Like Mitsuyami, let's say they played Magatama instead of Great Purification, would have still been a pretty layered end board. You know, you Dark Ruler it or Droplet it, they still have Surprise set, they still have Magatama set, they still have card advantage because they have a bunch of stuff in hand, and they still have Prayers, which, okay, in the Dark Ruler example, they can't use Prayers to bring back the Murakumo, but they can still tribute the Murakumo and then bring it back with its own effect, right? So like, there would have still been a lot of layers to that deck. It would have still been a powerful deck, but it just becomes so much easier for the Mitsuyami player and so much more broken if they can just negate the Dark Ruler, of course. Like, why worry about the back and forth of using your interruptions correctly after you get Dark Rulered if you can just negate the Dark Ruler, right? So like, yeah. Which is all, this category of cards, the searchable trap cards, is even more exaggerated in the TCG, where you have side decks to just bring these cards into your deck if you don't want the risk of having them in your hand when you're going second in game one. But even in Master Duel, in Best of One, everyone is playing this card. In Mitsurugi Yami, everyone is playing this card. They're just taking the risk of bricking on it going second because it is that powerful, right? So I think searchable trap cards in general should not have Omni Negates on them. I'm not a big fan of when they do. I think it just has too much risk attached to it, even though if in some cases it is okay if the deck is properly restricted to not go into any slop piles, and also the card is preferably not a straight up Omni Negate, but more like something with counterplay, right? Like Draco Tail. Which brings me to non-engine, I guess, because we've talked about most of the stuff that is like generically accessible via the extra deck or in engine. Negation non-engine, right? It comes in a lot of different forms, and of course recently I've personally been on a vendetta against Ash Blossom. I personally believe that Ash Blossom does not belong in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, and I will elaborate a little bit more later. But in general, like I said earlier, I think the plan of negating all of your opponent's cards is not very fun. Whether you think it's powerful or not is a different question, because a lot of people have been arguing like, okay, cards like Imperm and Valor, they don't even feel that strong anymore. And it's just something that if you don't resolve them all Charmy, they sometimes feel like the next best option you have. But most of the time, the gameplay that stems from these cards is not that good anymore, in my opinion, which is not the fault of Infinite Impermanence. It's more so the fault of the card design that's happened since these cards have been so popular, right? Like they've just made more decks that are just better into these cards, right? Decks these days have less choke points, less things that you can meaningfully interrupt with Infinite Impermanence, which usually just boils down to the gameplay of, well, if they have the extender to push through the imperm, then I'm screwed. K9 Noroi, for example, is something that provides so much card advantage in one card that not hitting it with an imperm is basically impossible. Or I guess an even better example would be Effect Veiler, because K9 also has Ripper, which negates hand traps, which is something we're also going to talk about in a second. You better believe that. You have to Veiler Noroi. If you don't Veiler Noroi, you are basically losing the game on the spot. If Veiler is the only hand trap that you have in your hand. Of course, there's pairings with like Veiler plus Nib or whatever, but just in general, the concept of these cards, like if your opponent summons Noroi and you don't Veiler it, then the Veiler becomes significantly harder to use after, right? So, and then you Veiler the Noroi, and then you just see if your opponent has the extender or not. If they don't have the extender, they literally just pass the turn and you've negated everything they could have done, or they keep playing like nothing happened, right? If they have Jokul level 5 in hand or whatever, then, you know, the Veiler was for nothing. Which says nothing about the power level of these cards. It just means they're risky to use. But what I do think it does is it provides uninteresting gameplay, and we should strive to move away from this, I suppose. However, when we're talking about negations, I think Imperm and Veiler are actually two of the most healthy forms of negation that we have in hand trap form, because they are not as powerful these days, which I think is a good thing because it makes them worse when you go first. I think an Imperm and a Veiler is something that most decks these days can play around when they go second, because there's a lot of ways to dodge these cards. There's a lot of ways to play through these cards. And similar to cards like Draco Tail Flame, they just have ways to be avoided because they target. And I think that's important. I think targeting negation is much better in terms of design than just respond to card, negate card, right? Which is one of my biggest problems with cards like Dominus Purge and Dominus Impulse, which I don't think either of these cards are necessarily super broken. I do think Dominus Impulse is on the line of being broken, but like both of these cards have restrictions to them, which I think is good. I think both of these cards, you know, going second are completely valid. I don't like how powerful they feel when the player going first uses them, but at least they can't negate your opponent's hand traps, which is, I think, the worst category of negates that we're going to get to in a second. I think there's a difference with how powerful these cards feel. Like, and I think it's easy to make it out, right? Like, there's a lot of cards that instantly lose to a Dominus Purge, but have a lot of outplay potential against an Infinite Impermanence, like Ketu, Draco Tail, whatever, you name it. Like, there's a lot of ways to play around Imperms, and like every time my opponent passes with set cards, I'm basically hoping it's Imperm and not a Dominus card, because those are basically just deleting a card from my hand, whereas Imperm and Veiler don't do that. Going second, I have no issue with all of these, even if I'm not a fan of the gameplay that they provide. That is a different topic, right? I don't think any of these cards are too powerful when you're going second. I just think they're not interesting, because the goal of all these cards these days is to not let the opponent play. In most cases, of course, there's exceptions to this rule. There's certain decks that you can let play, and then you just like negate a key card somewhere down the line, which is usually the most healthy form. And now, my least favorite form of negation is cards that negate hand traps. And I know this is controversial because there's people out there that hate hand traps, and they think having cards like Called by the Grave is appropriate so that the rogue deck can play through the Molcharmi or through the Ash Blossom or whatever. Quite frankly, I think at a competitive level, I think this is I think it's a majority of competitive players that agree. Cards like Called by the Grave just make it way too easy for the player going first, because Yu-Gi-Oh decks are too powerful these days. This is just a fact, whether we like it or not. I personally don't think it's a good thing how powerful some Yu-Gi-Oh decks are these days, but I'm also hopeful that they're going to dial down the power level a little bit in the future. But in a world where combo decks exist that essentially auto-win the game when they go first, cards that just stop your opponent's only chance of interacting are not okay. And whether it's Called by the Grave or whether it's a generic extra deck monster like K9 Ripper, I don't see a difference in these cases. I think none of this should exist. I think hand traps should resolve. If a hand trap is auto-winning the game, then it's obviously also a problem, right? And then the hand trap is the problem, but not Called by the Grave can only ever be a very, very bad band-aid fix to a problem like that, right? Like if you are, for example, if you are of the opinion that Called by the Grave needs to exist because it negates Max C and Max C wins too many games, then the solution is to get rid of Max C as well. Like that is just the thing, right? And so this is also where Ash Blossom goes, by the way. Ash Blossom goes into this category, whether you like it or not. This is something, I made a video about this a while ago, and I think a bunch of people agreed with me, but also a lot of people called me crazy for wanting Ash Blossom banned. I want to clarify a couple of things about this. I don't think Ash Blossom is too powerful of a card in general. What I dislike about Ash Blossom is that it is a relatively mediocre card going second. It's still a decent hand trap, don't get me wrong. Just like even better than Imperm and Veiler most of the time, I would say. But for the most part, the gameplay that Ash provides going second is not super interesting. You just Ash something and hope they can't play. Against most decks, this is true. It's not true against every deck. My GOAT Draco Tail coming through with good game design and balance again. Against Draco Tail, you can hold Ash for like a late Rahu or for one of the traps on your turns, completely fine. But against most decks, you just Ash one of the first things you see. You, of course, try to wait for an important choke point, but most of the time, relatively early, you Ash them, and you just hope that that makes them unable to play or at least play very little. Which is not great gameplay, but fine. I would be fine if that's what Ash was doing all the time, but I think Ash is just ridiculously strong for the player going first, because first of all, it negates Mulcharmies, which is a different topic, whether you like the Mulcharmies or not. I personally am a fan of the Mulcharmies because I think they give the player going second a reasonable chance to win. I don't think they make it super easy to win all the time going second with how modern decks play into them. You know, you look at decks like Vanquish Soul, you look at decks like Draco Tail, even Yami, most of those decks are completely fine into the Mulcharmies. If anything, Fuva is maybe a little bit too strong, but the way they're designing decks these days, most of them are now fine into Fuva. So on a competitive level, I think the Mulcharmies just should resolve. The even bigger problem is just that the player going first after they've ashed a Mulcharmy is just playing against 4 cards and still doing the full combo with 1 or 2 cards, which leads to a full board, and then the opponent just doesn't have enough resources to win the game. And if your opponent doesn't have a Mulcharmy, then you're already favored to win the game. You're already making a board. And then you also have Ash on top of all of this, which is one of the most powerful Omni negates because it cannot be dodged like Imperm or Veiler. You know, it can't, it doesn't target. It just changes to basically any starter in the game and negates it. And so you're just trading a hand trap that had nothing to do with your end board with one of your opponent's starters, and now they're infinitely less likely to win the game. I've been paying attention to this since I made the video, and I've seen so many more games won by Ash when the player was going first holding it than Ash actually making a meaningful difference going second. And if Ash was winning the game going second, most of the time, if it wasn't against Draco Tail, it was just because it made the opponent pass because they drew 1 starter, which wasn't very enjoyable. So I guess this is my daily Ash rant out of the way, but in general, I think the player going first in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is already very much favored. So I think cards that negate interaction when you're going first are not healthy for the game, is how I feel about it. Which brings me to the last category of cards that are technically also non-engine, which is the Solemn Traps, or I mean, counter traps in general, right? I technically have no issue with these. I think cards like Solemn Strike, Solemn Warning, Solemn Judgment are fine power level wise. They are, the thing is, I don't think these cards are interesting either, and I guess I hope I was able to make it clear, and I'm interested to hear from you guys on whether you feel the same way about negates in general. I don't find these cards interesting, but they are also on the priority list of cards that I'm concerned about when it comes to the side deck. These cards are very low, right? Like when my opponent is siding in Solemn Strike, at least they're not siding in a Floodgate. So I guess I'll take it. And also they don't negate hand traps. So if I have like a Mulcharmy, my opponent might be able to say like, okay, I'll set my Solemn Strike and pass to not give you as many draws, but then at least I get a chance to play the game, which is different than if the Solemn Strike was like a Called by the Grave or an Ash Blossom. Like I would 10 times more like I would prefer to play against Solemn Strike than an Ash Blossom when I'm going second, which I think says a lot about the power of Ash Blossom going first when you look at how good of a card Solemn Strike is. But so yeah, I think these cards are fine for now. I think once they get rid of all the floodgates and stuff, hopefully for the side deck, then maybe these are something that everyone is going to play and then we can talk about them again. But for now, I think it is pretty low on the list of priorities. Yeah, it's a difficult topic, and I hope I wasn't rambling too much in all kind of different directions, but TLDR, I guess, to get this to a close so this isn't too long. I think negates have a place in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think at the point where we are, we do need ways to stop super powerful board breakers, or at least like not auto lose to a single card when we're going first. I think it's all right if decks have a way to set up like a specific negation. I'm a much bigger fan of cards that negate just monsters or just spells or whatever, because that leaves room for counterplay, right? Like if something only is a monster negate, you can out it with spells. If something's only a spell negate, you can out it with monsters, which is more interesting than just straight up losing a card to it all the time. I think if they're making Omni negates, I would like them to be more like Zaylan the Shackled Dragon, which has outplay potential built in. I wish to not see as many cards that are straight up just like Baron, Appaloosa, which is just a monster negate but negates multiple things. Searchable counter traps and archetypes, that sort of stuff is something I'm not a big fan of. I think when it comes to non-engine, I think targeted negation is okay, even though not the most interesting, but fine. I think negation that just responds to a card and straight up negates it without any chance to dodge it is kind of cringe. And Ash Blossom, because it negates hand traps and hand trap negates in general, don't really have a place in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! At least not at 3. Like, I'm not a fan of Cult by the Grave being at 1, and every time it happens, I'm annoyed by it, but at least it doesn't happen as often. So I personally, as of now, I don't see a reason why Ash shouldn't follow the same path. And when it happens in engine, it's even worse, because then they do it every game, right? So K9 Ripper is probably one of my least favorite cards designed in recent years. That's crazy. But yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know, did you enjoy this video? Should I make more about different aspects of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game? I've been thinking about making one video on just like what I consider good and healthy interactive Yu-Gi-Oh! If you would like to see that, then feel free to let me know. If there's any other aspects of the game that you would like me to cover, you know, like make a dedicated video on floodgates or whatever. I don't know if I've ever done that. Let me know. Also, let me know what you think of the style of this video. I currently don't really have the time to completely properly script all of these through and then have them edited with like fancy stuff. That is usually something I would prefer to do, but I'm just like don't have the time to manage all that at the moment, to be honest with you. But if that's something you would prefer, then also feel free to give me that feedback. Until then, thank you all so much for watching today. Let me know your opinion down below. Make sure to subscribe so we can hit 100K. And thank you for watching. Bye bye. Peace.